Hello and welcome. If you enjoy long, unhurried journeys through the world that exists beneath the one you can see, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps this quiet corner of the deep keep finding its way to you. Before you settle in, take a moment to share where you're listening from tonight. A bedroom with the curtains drawn, a room where the house has gone quiet, an armchair somewhere still and dark, somewhere the world outside has already slowed to almost nothing. Wherever that place is, you are resting on a surface that is, by geological measure, almost unimaginably thin. And below it, right now, the planet has never stopped moving. Here is the number that set this whole journey in motion. The Kola superdeep borehole in northwestern Russia is the deepest point human beings have ever reached. It took nearly 20 years to drill. It goes 12,262 meters into the earth, and it covers less than 0.2% of the distance to the planet's center, less than 1/5 of 1%. That is how little we have seen. That is how much remains. And in those 12 kilometers alone, just those 12 kilometers mean us. Soviet scientists found things that quietly overturned everything their models had predicted. Liquid water pooling where no water should exist, rock temperatures nearly double what anyone had expected, and a drill that stopped not from mechanical failure, but because the ground itself had turned soft around it. The rock had become plastic. They could go no further. So what does lie below? What is the ocean floor like at nearly 11 kilometers of depth, where the pressure reaches 8 tons per square inch, and the temperature barely climbs above freezing? Is anything alive down there? And if so, what kind of creature can survive a world like that? What is the mantle, and how does something solid manage to flow? Why is there a liquid iron ocean wrapped around the center of this world? And how did a Danish seismologist in 1936 deduce from the ghost of a distant earthquake that somewhere inside that liquid there is a solid sphere, turning at its own separate pace, independent of everything above it? Tonight we descend through all of it, slowly, one layer at a time, from the thin crust beneath you now, down through the ocean trenches, down through ancient rock and flowing mantle and molten iron, all the way to the quiet heart of the world. You don't need to follow closely. Let the layers settle around you as you settle into the dark. We have a very long way to go, and no particular reason to hurry. For now, stay here at the surface a little longer, in the room where you are lying. Notice how solid the ground beneath you feels. Notice how completely still it seems, how permanent, as though the floor of your home, the soil under the street, the bedrock under the whole city, were the fixed and final foundation of everything. It is one of the most reasonable assumptions a person can make. It is also very quietly untrue. The stillness you feel is real only at the scale of a single human life. Widen the frame, stretch it out across the long patience of geological time, and the ground becomes something else entirely. A thin, cooled skin over a body of rock and metal that is in every direction beneath you, hotter, denser, and slowly in motion. Beneath the exact place you are resting tonight, the distance to the center of the earth is 6,371 kilometers, straight down, and almost none of it is anything we have ever seen, or touched, or sampled directly. Everything we know about that vast interior we have had to gather patiently from the outside, from faint signals and rare hard-won glimpses at its edges. Hold that thought gently as we go, and let it loosen the ordinary certainty of the floor beneath you, nearly everything ahead of us is a place no human eye has ever looked upon, and no human hand will ever reach. And yet we are not left entirely in the dark. We know something of that great vertical distance beneath you. Not everything, and almost none of it by looking, but something real, something measured, gathered patiently across many lifetimes by people who never came close to the places they spent their lives trying to describe. The number I gave you a moment ago, that long fall to the center of the world, did not arrive all at once, whole and finished, handed down from some single moment of discovery. It was assembled. It was guessed at and corrected again across more than 150 years by sailors and physicists and engineers who each added one careful figure to a picture that none of them would ever live to see completed. Tonight I want to walk you gently backward along that chain of figures, from the crude and the hopeful to the astonishing, because the story of how we came to know the depth of the world is, in its own quiet way, as strange as the depths themselves. It begins not with a laboratory, but with a rope. For most of human history, the only way to ask the sea how deep it was to lower something heavy over the side of a ship and wait for the line to go slack. A weight, a length of cord, a patient hand paying it out fathom by fathom. And the word itself tells you how human this measurement once was, because a fathom was never a scientific unit at all. It was the span of a man's outstretched arms, fingertip to fingertip, the width of a person reaching as wide as they could, roughly 1 4/5 of a meter of ordinary human body. To measure the abyss, in other words, we began by counting how many times a human being, stretched to their fullest, could be stacked between the surface and the seafloor. It is one of the oldest instruments we have, the reaching human body, and for thousands of years it was the only one we had. The first time anyone lowered that rope into the deepest water on Earth and understood, even dimly, what they had found was on the 23rd of March, 1875. The ship was a converted British warship, her guns mostly stripped out and replaced with laboratories and winches and coils of hemp line, and she carried the plain and now famous name of Challenger. She was 3 years into a voyage that would circle the globe, dragging nets and dropping weighted cords, and slowly inventing, almost by accident, the entire science of the ocean. And on that particular day, at a spot in the Western Pacific her crew logged simply as Station 225, they let the line run out and further out than seemed possible. When it finally touched bottom, they read off a depth of 4,475 fathoms, nice around 8,184 meters of water beneath the keel. No one aboard fully believed it. It was deeper than anything anyone had ever recorded, deeper than the tallest mountains they knew were high, and they had found it not with sonar or satellites, but with rope and weight and a great deal of waiting. Here is the quiet marvel and the quiet humbling of that first number. It was wrong. Not carelessly wrong, not foolishly wrong, but wrong by more than 2.5 kilometers. A gross underestimate, because a hemp line miles long does not fall straight and true through moving water, and a weight cannot tell you cleanly when it is stopped falling. The men of the Challenger had reached toward the deepest place on the planet and come up short by a distance greater than the height of most mountains. And yet consider what they had actually done. With nothing but a rope and their own patience, they had found the deepest ocean on Earth, and they had come within striking distance of a truth it would take another century of instruments to pin down. The number was quaint, the achievement was not. For more than 70 years that 1870s figure was more or less where matters rested. And then the same name returned to the same stretch of water. In 1951, a second British vessel, Challenger II, arrived above that deep trough, carrying something her namesake had never possessed, an echo sounder, and a sounding line not of hemp but of wire. Instead of dropping a weight and reading off a length, this newer science sent a pulse of sound down through the black water and listened for the faint return, timing the echo, letting the speed of sound in seawater do the measuring, and the wire went deeper than the rope ever had. This time the figure came back as 5,940 fathoms, about 10,863 meters, nearly 2.5 kilometers deeper than the proud old rope had ever managed to reach. It was so much deeper, and now measured with such new confidence, that the crew gave the place a name it still carries. They called it, after both the ships that had found it, the Challenger Deep. And in that single act of naming, the earlier number quietly became history, misers. Not a mistake to be mocked, but a first faltering step that the second ship had simply outgrown. Notice the pattern already forming, the pattern that will carry us all the way down tonight. Each generation reaches as far as its tools allow, sets down a number in good faith, and is then gently overtaken by the next. The rope gave way to the wire gave way to sound, and the men who read the wire in 1951 had, without knowing it, just made themselves quaint in turn, because within a single decade the whole way of asking the question was about to change. We would stop lowering things into the deep to measure it. We would begin lowering ourselves. That astonishing leap came on the 23rd of January, 1960. 2 men climbed into a vessel that looked nothing like a submarine and everything like a small, defiant idea. A great float filled with lighter-than-water fuel, and slung beneath it a cramped steel sphere just wide enough for 2 people to sit knee to knee in the dark. It was called the Trieste, a bathyscaphe, a diving ship built to sink on purpose and rise again. Inside it sat a Swiss oceanographer named Jacques Piccard and a young lieutenant of the United States Navy named Don Walsh. And on that January morning they did what no human being had ever done, and what only a handful have done since. They dropped, quite deliberately, toward the floor of the Challenger Deep. Think about what that descent actually was, because it was not a plunge and it was not an adventure in the way a film might tell it. It was slow. It was patient in a way that borders on the unbearable. The fall took 4 hours and 47 minutes, nearly 5 hours of watching the last light of the sun thin out and vanish, of feeling the sphere grow cold, of listening to the small sounds of steel under a pressure that climbed without pause. Somewhere past 9,000 meters down, with the surface a distance greater than most aircraft ever climb, now stacked above their heads, one of the outer window panes cracked with a report that shook the entire vessel, a single sharp fracture in the dark, and nothing to be done but keep going or turn back, and they kept going. When at last they settled onto the pale ooze of the seafloor, they had crossed the deepest water on the planet in a machine barely tested for it, and they stayed only 20 minutes. 20 minutes at the bottom of the world after 5 hours of falling descents, because the cracked pane and the cold and the sheer unknown of the place made lingering unwise, and because sometimes simply to have touched a thing is enough. And here is the part worth holding as you lie there. Picard and Walsh did not really bring back a better number. They did not need to. What they brought back was something the rope and the wire could never carry, the knowledge that a human being could go there at all and return. The measurements would be refined later, by other people, with better instruments, in years still to come lies, and we will get to the figure we trust today, the one settled only very recently, and to the strange fact that our best estimate of the deepest point on Earth was still being adjusted by meters within living memory. But in 1960, the question quietly changed shape. It was no longer only how deep is it, it became what is it like down there, and can we survive the going? So follow the chain with me as it stands so far, and feel how each link makes the one before it seems small. A rope reaching into the 1870s dark, guessing at 8,000 meters and missing by mountains. A wire and an echo in 1951, finding 2.5 kilometers more and giving the place its name. And two men in a cracked steel sphere in 1960, ceasing to measure the deep from a distance and beginning, instead to inhabit it. Each was the furthest reach of its age. Each was, within a generation, left behind. And not one of these steps, not the rope nor the wire nor the two brave men in the dark, had yet touched the thing that should trouble us most. Because for all of it, for every fathom hard won across those decades, the deepest place in the entire ocean is still only a shallow graze upon the surface of the world, and the far greater depth, the true descent, was one that no rope and no submarine could ever begin to reach. Consider then the fourth link in that chain, arriving more than half a century after the two men in their cracked steel sphere. On the 26th of March, 2012, a single human being went down alone. His name was James Cameron, better known for the films he had made than for the water he was willing to enter, and he descended in a slender vertical craft called Deep Sea Challenger. Not a bubble of buoyant petrol like the old bathyscaphe, but a narrow green tower, built to fall like a dart and to rise, when its work was done, like a cork. The descent took him 2 hours and 36 minutes, swifter than the 4 hours and 47 minutes his predecessors had endured, and when he reached the floor, he did not linger for a few nervous minutes and turn at once for home. He stayed for some 3 hours. He remains, to this day, the human being who has spent the longest unbroken stretch of time at the very bottom of the world. And he spent every minute of it entirely by himself, 10,908 meters beneath the surface, with no companion in the dark and no one within any possible reach who might have helped him. To climb back toward the light, he released 2 heavy weights, 536 pounds each, and let the lightened craft be carried gently upward through the miles of water it had crossed. And notice, as the chain lengthens, how quaint the earlier links have quietly become. The two men of 1960, who seemed so bold only a moment ago, had 20 minutes on the bottom, and at least each other. This one man had 3 hours, and only himself. Not a crew, but a single mind, not a fleeting glimpse, but a long, slow afternoon spent walking the deepest sediment on the surface of the earth. Perhaps this is a good moment simply to loosen your hold a little, to let these numbers wash over you rather than grip them tightly, because the point of the chain is not really the arithmetic, It is the shape of the thing. Each generation reaches a little further into the dark. Each is certain it has gone about as far as anyone ever could. And each within a lifetime is proved modest by the one that comes after. Yet all four of these links, the rope, the wire, the two men, and the lone filmmaker minus, for all the difference in their daring, were measuring the very same thing. They were sounding the deepest floor of the ocean, and that floor, remarkable as it is, lies only about 11 kilometers beneath the waves. There was another kind of descent underway in those same decades, quieter and slower and stranger, and it did not go down through water at all. It went down through solid stone. On the 24th of May 1970, on a cold peninsula in the far north of Russia, near the port city of Murmansk and hard against the Arctic, a team of Soviet scientists began not to sink but to drill. They were not chasing a trench, and they were not chasing a record in the sea. They wanted to touch the crust of the planet itself, to bore a slender wound straight down into the rock and read, foot by foot, whatever the rock had to say. And they drilled patiently for the better part of 2 decades. 19 years of turning, of broken bits and long repairs, of hauling up cores of ancient rock, and sending the drill back down again into ground no instrument had ever felt. By 1989, that single hole, the Kola Superdeep Borehole as it came to be called, had reached a depth of 12,262 meters. Sit with that number for a moment. It is deeper than Challenger Deep. It is deeper than the deepest point in all the world's oceans, deeper by more than a full kilometer nines. And yet the hole that achieved it was, at its mouth, only about 23 centimeters across. 9 inches. A small circle you could cover with a dinner plate and step across without a thought. The deepest place humanity has ever reached into its own planet is a scratch you could straddle. And it stopped, in the end, not because the money ran out first, though eventually it did, but because the Earth itself quietly refused to let them go any further. By 1992, at a depth of 11,882 meters, the rock had grown hot beyond all expectation. The planners had reckoned on something near 100 degrees Celsius at that depth. What they found instead was 180 degrees, 356 on the Fahrenheit scale, and at that heat the rock was no longer behaving as rock is supposed to behave. It had ceased to be brittle and solid. It had begun, slowly, to flow, to soften and close around the drill bit like warm wax, so that the drill was no longer cutting stone so much as struggling through a slow, hot plastic dark. The project was formally abandoned in 1995, and the site was sealed and decommissioned in 2008. A single welded metal cap now covers the deepest hole ever made, closed over the mouth of a wound that reaches 12 kilometers into the earth, and simply stops. And here, gently, is where the chain must break, where every link we have followed arrives together at the same humbling place. The rope, the wire, the 2 men, the 1 man and the 20-year drill, all of it went down. And none of it, truly, went deep. Lie still for a moment and let this settle around you. The floor beneath you, the mattress, the frame, the boards, the foundation, the soil, the bedrock far below the soil, all of that, the entire reach of everything human hands have ever pierced or plumbed, is the thinnest possible rind upon something almost unimaginably larger. The deepest hole ever bored by human beings reaches 12,262 meters. The centre of the Earth lies 6,371 kilometres beneath your resting body. Set those two numbers quietly, side by side, and the pride drains out of the larger one, because Kola is the record, the marvel, the deepest scratch in all of history, reached down only about 1/500th part of the way to the middle. Not halfway, not 1/10th of the way, not 100th, less than 0.2%.
So here is the crushing truth to carry with you as you drift. Everything our species has ever drilled, or dived to, or filmed, or held in its hands from the inside of its own world amounts to nothing more than a faint graze upon the outermost skin, and the whole vast descent that truly matters. The 2,900 kilometers of slow-flowing mantle, the churning ocean of liquid iron beneath it, and the solid silent heart burning at the very center hotter than the surface of the sun, has never been touched, and very likely never will be, by anything at all except a trembling wave of sound.
And it is worth lingering just for a while on that trembling wave of sound, because it is not a poetic flourish, but a plain and astonishing truth. That faint wave is very nearly the whole of what we have. It is the single unlikely key by which we have come to know anything at all about a place that no drill will ever reach and no eye will ever see. We cannot go down there. We have settled that between us already. But every so often, without being asked, the earth sends something up to us instead, the Eisodlish. And if you know how to listen, that something carries a message from depths that would otherwise remain forever sealed. Think for a moment of what happens when the ground gives way. Somewhere beneath the surface, along one of the great fractures where slabs of rock have been leaning against one another for centuries, the strain at last becomes too much, and the rock slips. We feel that slip at the surface as an earthquake as shaking, as alarm, as something to be endured and survived. But the shaking you feel underfoot is only the smallest part of what has been let loose. The real event is invisible. In the instant the rock breaks, it sends a pulse of energy outward in every direction at once, not only sideways across the land, but downward, inward, straight into the body of the planet. And the whole earth, for a few quiet minutes, rings. It rings the way a bell rings when it is struck, or the way a wine glass hums when a wet fingertip is drawn slowly around its rim. A deep, sustained, almost inaudible tone that travels clean through the solid interior and out the other side. We have learned to catch that tone. All around the world, in vaults and cellars and patient stations set far from traffic, there are instruments so sensitive that they can feel the ground rise and fall by less than the width of a single hair. And when a great earthquake happens on one side of the planet, these instruments, one after another, register its passing, first the stations nearby, then those a little further off, and at last, some 20 minutes or so later, the ones on the far side of the world, where the wave arrives having travelled directly through the deep centre. By comparing the exact instant each instrument stirs, this one in the hills of the north, that one on a plain in the far south, another on a small island in the middle of an ocean, Sinnis, we can reconstruct the path the wave took and the speed it kept along the way, and in the doing of that, something quietly extraordinary happens. The planet, which is the most solid and opaque thing any of us will ever know, becomes in a sense transparent, not transparent to light, which cannot pierce even the first few meters of rock, but transparent to sound. We cannot look through the earth, but we can, it turns out, listen through it. Now here is the part that turns listening into knowing, and it rests upon a single beautiful distinction. When the rock breaks, it does not send out one kind of wave, but two. and the two behave in profoundly different ways. The first, and by far the swifter, is a wave of pure compression, a pulse of push and pull, squeezing the rock together and stretching it apart again in the very same direction that it is travelling, exactly as a sound wave squeezes the air on its way to your ear. This first wave is a tireless traveller. It will pass through very nearly anything you place in its way, through solid granite, through molten metal, through water, even through open air. Almost nothing stops it. It simply presses onward. The second wave is slower, and it moves in an altogether different manner. Rather than squeezing the rock along its path, it shakes it from side to side, a shimmying sideways ripple, like the flick that runs down a length of rope when you snap one end of it. And this second wave carries within it a strict and unbreakable rule. It can travel only through a solid. It needs something rigid to shake, some material stiff enough to be shoved sideways and to spring back again. Give it a liquid, and it is helpless. A liquid has no rigidity to offer. It merely flows out of the way of any sideways push and never springs back at all. So when this shimmying wave meets molten rock or open water, it does not slow and it does not bend. It stops. It dies at the very edge of the liquid, swallowed and silenced, as though it had walked straight into a wall made of nothing. And that single fact, that one of the two waves can cross a liquid, and the other simply cannot minus, is the finest instrument we have ever possessed for reading the inside of the world. Because when a truly great earthquake shakes the whole planet, and the recorders across the globe wait to receive its arrival, a strange thing is discovered. There is a wide band of the earth, on the far side from the quake, where the shimmying wave never appears at all. The compression wave reaches there, faint but present. Its slower companion does not. All the way around a great swathe of the globe, the sideways wave falls silent, as if a shadow had been cast across the planet, a shadow not of darkness but of absence, a region into which one kind of wave can reach and the other never can. Sit with what that silence means, because it is one of the quietest and most profound deductions in all of science. If the shimmying wave, which can pass only through solids, is being swallowed somewhere on its long journey through the deep interior, then somewhere down there, along the paths it fails to finish, it must be meeting something that is not solid. It must be meeting a liquid. Not a small pocket of it, not a buried lake, but a vast layer, an ocean of molten material large enough to throw its shadow across a third of the planet. No one drilled to it. No one saw it. No one ever will. It was found in a pattern of silences, in the places where an expected tremor, again and again, refused to arrive. And from that refusal, patiently mapped across many decades and across many thousands of earthquakes, we drew the outline of a truth, that beneath the cool stone floor you are resting upon tonight, past the crust, past the roughly 2,900 kilometers of slow-creeping mantle, the heart of the earth turns partly to liquid. And this, you should know, is happening even now. It is not some rare or ceremonial event. Somewhere on the earth at this very moment, a fault is slipping, a small quake is releasing its energy into the deep, and its waves are spreading outward through the rock, including, very possibly, through the ground directly beneath the room where you lie. Faint pulses from a tremor half a world away may be threading up through the floor beneath you as you rest, far too gentle for your body ever to notice, and yet perfectly real, passing through you and onward, carrying with them the very shape of a planet's hidden interior. You are, in the most literal sense, lying inside the instrument. The whole earth is ringing, very softly all the time, and only our patience and our machines are ever quiet enough to hear it. As those waves travel down and through, they do not hold to a single steady pace. They quicken where the rock grows dense and stiff, they slacken where it softens, and above all they bend, refracting at every boundary where one kind of material gives way to another, exactly as a beam of light bends as it passes from air into water. And each of those bends is a message. Each is a boundary made audible. It is by tracing these bends and these subtle changes of speed that we have come to know not one hidden layer, but a whole nested architecture, the thin skin of the crust, the boundary just beneath it where the rock changes its very character, the enormous mantle sprawling below that, and then far further down, that great liquid caster of shadows, the molten core. The earth turns out not to be a single solid ball at all, but a set of concentric shells, each with its own substance and its own quiet behaviour, wrapped one inside the next like the layers of an onion held up before a lamp, save that here the lamp is an earthquake, and the light is sound. But the story does not end at that liquid layer, and this is the thread I should like to leave gently resting in your hand as the night grows deeper. For within that molten shadow, hidden inside the very region where the shimmying wave was believed to vanish altogether, there waited one further surprise, a faint and unexpected arrival, a whisper of a wave turning up in a place the textbooks had sworn was empty. For a long time, no one could make sense of it. It would take a single careful mind, working almost alone, with little more than pencil, paper, and an almost inhuman patience, to look at that faint whisper and understand what it was trying to say about the deepest place of all. We shall come back to her, and to what she found buried at the very centre of the world, a little later in the night. For now it is enough simply to hold the shape of the method itself, and to let its strangeness settle over you like a blanket drawn slowly to the chin, that everything we know of the unreachable interior, every layer and boundary and molten sea, we know only because the planet now and then trembles, and because we learned, very slowly, how to listen to the sound of it settling. And listen we did, patiently for the better part of a century, until the faint arrivals and the missing ones together drew for us a map of a world we will never touch. It is worth pausing here, in the quiet, to walk that map slowly downward, not as a scientist reading a chart, but as a body imagining a fall. Picture yourself, just for a moment, sinking gently through the floor beneath your bed, not falling in fear, but drifting, the way you are about to drift into sleep, straight down through the skin of the planet toward its hidden heart. The first stretch is almost nothing. The crust, the whole of the solid world you have ever stood upon, every mountain and seabed and city foundation mice, is only the thinnest rind, a few tens of kilometers of cool rock at most. That deepest wound we ever cut into it, the great Russian borehole with a mouth no wider than a dinner plate, reached a little over 12 kilometers down before the heat defeated it and turned it back. And yet, set against the whole descent, 12 kilometers is scarcely the first breath of the journey. The distance from where you lie to the very centre of the earth is close to 6,371 kilometers. Our deepest scratch, then, is not a tunnel into the planet at all. It is a pinprick in the peel of an orange. It is less than 1 part in 500 of the way down. Everything the human race has ever directly touched of the inside of its own world is that first thin sliver, and all the rest, all the immensity beneath it, we know only by listening. So keep sinking past that thin rind, and the world changes character entirely. You cross a quiet boundary, the place where the crust ends and the mantle begins, and now you are moving through the thickest layer of all, a body of rock nearly 2,900 kilometers deep. This is the great middle of the earth, and it is stranger than the plain word rock will allow. It is not molten, whatever the old pictures suggested, not a waiting sea of fire beneath a fragile shell. It is solid stone, made mostly of silicon and magnesium and oxygen bound together into silicate rock. And yet, over the enormous slow reaches of geological time, this solid stone flows. It creeps. It turns over on itself the way something thick and warm turns in a jar, only across millions of years rather than minutes, so slowly that in a whole human life you would never once see it stir. Near its top the rock already glows at something like 870 degrees Celsius, and as you fall deeper the heat climbs and climbs until, near its base, it approaches 4,000 degrees. You are sinking now through stone hotter than any furnace we could build on the surface, and still it holds together, still it presses in patient and enormous and unbearably slow. And then, almost 3,000 kilometers down, 2,890 kilometers, to give the figure the seismic waves eventually settled upon Nanas. The character of the world changes once more, and this time it changes utterly. The solid mantle ends. Beneath it lies a sea. Not a sea of water, but a sea of liquid metal, an ocean of molten iron and nickel, more than 2,000 kilometers deep, glowing somewhere between 4,500 and 5,500 degrees Celsius. Here is where the listening truly earned its keep. Remember those two kinds of tremor the earth sends out when it shakes? The pushing wave that shoves the rock forward and back, and the shearing wave that shivers it from side to side. The shearing wave has one great weakness. It cannot cross a liquid. It needs something rigid to shudder against, and a liquid simply yields and lets it die. So when the seismologists traced the shearing waves marching down through the solid mantle, and then, at that exact depth, vanishing Ninus, not weakening, but stopping, as though they had walked clean off the edge of the world Ninus, they understood what it meant. Below there was no longer anything solid to shake. Below, the earth was liquid. We never saw that ocean. We heard the silence where a wave should have been, and from the silence we read the sea. And that hidden ocean is not idle. It moves. It churns and rolls, heat rising from below and sinking again from above, vast currents of molten metal turning slowly in the dark. And because that metal is iron, and because moving iron carries with it the seeds of electricity and magnetism, this churning ocean does something to you, right now, that you have never once felt and could not live a single day without. It generates the magnetic field of the whole planet. Down at the core itself, that field is something like 50 times stronger than the faint trace of it that reaches the surface, but reach the surface it does, and further still, streaming out beyond the air, beyond the clouds, out into open space, where it stands between you and the ceaseless storm of particles the sun throws endlessly toward us. Every compass needle that has ever swung to point north was leaning, without knowing it, toward that ocean of iron. Every shimmering curtain of light that is ever hung in a polar sky is a place where that invisible shield is being struck and struck again. The thing itself surrounds you as you lie there in the dark. It is passing through your body at this very moment, through the room, through the whole sleeping house, unfelt and unbroken, a canopy woven, not in the sky but at the centre of the world, some 3,000 kilometres beneath the mattress, by a sea of fire you will never once see with your own eyes. There is something almost unbearably gentle in that thought, if you let it settle over you now. You are lying on the thinnest of surfaces, a cool, fragile skin of rock, floating on stone that flows, wrapped around an ocean of molten iron, wrapped in turn around a heart we have not yet named, all of it beneath you, all of it holding. The ground you trust so completely that you have never once thought to question it. It is only the outermost breath of something vast and hot and patient and ordered, turning slowly in the dark exactly as it is turned for thousands of millions of years, keeping the compass true and the sky quietly shielded while you sleep. You do not need to hold any of these numbers. Let them loosen and drift. And at the very centre of it all, past the flowing rock and the molten sea, in the place where the shearing wave went silent and only that one faint, impossible whisper remained, there waits a last thing, the deepest place there is, hotter than the mind can picture, and yet somehow, against all sense, solid, stranger than anything above it. We have heard its echo returning through the body of the earth. We have not yet gone down to meet it. But the night is long, and there is time enough, and it is waiting for us, quietly, at the bottom of everything. And so we go down to meet it, at last. Not in a vessel, because no vessel has ever been built that could carry a living person even a small fraction of the way there, and none ever will. Not through a shaft, because the deepest hole we have ever managed to scratch into the crust reached barely 12 kilometres, and the centre of the earth waits more than 6,000 kilometres further down than that. We go down the only way anyone ever has. We go down by listening. This is the quiet, almost unbelievable truth about the deepest place there is. No human eye has ever seen it. No instrument has ever touched it. No sample of it has ever been carried up into the daylight, and no sample of it ever will be, not in your lifetime, nor in the lifetime of anyone you will ever meet. Everything we know about the solid heart at the centre of the world, we have learnt the way you might learn the shape of an unlit room, standing in the doorway in the dark, by the way a sound returns to you from the far wall. We have never gone in. We have only stood at the threshold and listened, very carefully, to the echoes coming back. And the person who first understood what those echoes were telling us was a woman working quietly, more or less alone, at a small seismological station in Denmark. Her name was Inge Lehmann. She was born in the year 1888, and she lived remarkably to the age of 104, dying only in 1993, which means her life stretched from the age of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages all the way into the age of satellites and computers, and she spent a great deal of it thinking, more deeply than almost anyone before her, about what happens to a shudder as it passes through the whole thick body of our planet. To understand what she noticed, you have to understand something gentle and strange about earthquakes. When the ground somewhere ruptures and slips, it does not only shake the surface nearby, it sends waves downward, into the deep, and those waves travel clean through the interior of the earth and come up again on the far side of the world, where sensitive instruments, patient needles resting on drums of paper, record their arrival. And crucially, these waves do not all travel the same way. Some of them, the ones we call the primary waves, the fast ones, can pass through solid rock and through liquid alike. Others, the shearing waves, the slower ones, can only move through solids. They stop dead at any boundary where the rock gives way to liquid, because a liquid has nothing for a shearing motion to grip. And so, simply by noting which waves arrive on the far side of the Earth, and which ones fall silent and never appear at all, the early seismologists had already worked out, before layman's time, that somewhere down there was a vast region of liquid. That was how the molten outer core was first found. Not by seeing it. By noticing the silence where a certain kind of wave should have been, and was not. But there was a puzzle inside that silence, and it was laymen who saw it most clearly. There is a great earthquake near New Zealand in the year 1929, an enormous release of energy on the far side of the planet from her, and she sits with the records of it, the faint scratched traces of waves that have travelled all the way through the earth to reach her instruments in the north. Now, there is a region on the globe, on the far side from any large quake, that ought to lie in shadow. The liquid core sitting in the middle of the planet bends and blocks the fast waves in a particular way, casting a kind of acoustic shadow across a band of the Earth's surface where those waves by rights should not be able to reach. It is called the shadow zone, and the logic of it is clean and simple, and yet into that shadow, where nothing should have arrived, a few faint primary waves were arriving anyway, weak, delayed, unexpected, but unmistakably there. Signals from places that ought to have heard nothing at all. Consider for a moment how easy it would have been to look away from that. If every one of those waves had behaved exactly as the models predicted, if the shadow had been perfectly obediently empty, then there would have been nothing to explain, and the story of the Earth's centre might have stayed hidden for another generation. But a handful of them broke the rule, and Lemon, turning the problem over slowly and carefully, understood what it meant. The only way those waves could be bending back into the forbidden zone, the only way they could be reaching ears that should have been deaf to them, was if there were something solid buried inside the liquid core, a dense inner body, right at the very centre, with a sharp boundary around it, off which the waves could ricochet and be flung outward again into the shadow. She had in effect heard a hard thing hidden inside a soft thing, purely from the way a distant tremor came back changed. In 1936, she published her conclusion in a paper with what may be the most economical title in all of science. She called it simply P prime, a single letter and one small stroke beside it, nothing more. And in those few pages she gave the world its inner core, the last and deepest layer of the planet, discovered not with a spade or a submarine or a drill, but with patience, arithmetic, and an unwillingness to ignore the waves that should not have been there. The boundary she found, the surface of that hidden inner sphere, carries her name to this day. We call it the Lemon discontinuity. And she went on working, and thinking and publishing her careful papers on the deep earth well into her 90s, long after most of us would have set the questions down. So now let yourself sink toward the thing she found, the thing waiting directly beneath you, more than 6,300 kilometers straight down through the floor and the crust, and the flowing rock and the molten sea. It is a ball. A solid sphere of iron, laced with nickel, roughly 1,220 kilometers in radius, which is to say about 2,440 kilometers from one side to the other. That is not small. That is nearly 3/4 the width of our own moon, a whole world's worth of solid metal, sitting sealed at the centre of ours, and within that iron, in traces, a stranger companion still, small quantities of sulphur and cobalt, and dissolved through the metal, faint amounts of gold and of platinum, more of them than we will ever reach, locked away at the one place on earth that no one can ever go. There is a fortune at the centre of the world. It might as well be on the far side of a star. But here is the part that should gently unseat you, the part that is stranger than anything above it. This inner ball is hot, not warm, not merely molten metal hot, like the ocean of liquid iron surrounding it. Its temperature is somewhere around 5,200 degrees Celsius, which is very nearly the temperature of the visible surface of the sun. Hold that thought softly, without gripping it. There is, buried at the centre of the quiet planet you are lying upon, a sphere of iron as hot as the face of the sun. And by every instinct you have, by everything you know about heat and metal, a thing that hot should not be solid. Heat something that fiercely, and it melts, it runs, it becomes liquid, as the outer core all around it plainly has. And yet the inner core is solid. It is the one part of the deep earth where the shearing waves, the ones that die in any liquid, come back to life and travel through, which is precisely how we know it is firm. So how can iron hotter than molten iron be solid at all? The answer is a second force, quieter and even more relentless than heat, and it is pressure. The weight of the entire planet, every layer of rock and metal above, presses down upon that central ball with a force of something like 3.5 million times the pressure of the air resting on your skin right now. And under a squeeze that colossal, the atoms of iron are pushed so close together, held so tightly in their ordered ranks, that they simply cannot break free and flow, no matter how violently the heat urges them to. Pressure wins. It forces the metal to stay solid at a temperature that would otherwise have vaporized it long ago. The centre of the earth is solid not in spite of being unimaginably hot, but because it is being crushed harder than heat can pull it apart. Sit with that, if you like, for just a moment before we go any deeper. Everything you have been told about heat, that heat loosens things, that heat sets things moving and melts them and frees them, is true only up here, in the thin, gentle world of ordinary pressures where you happen to live. Go far enough down and the rules you grew up with quietly stop applying. Down there, the hottest place within reach of the planet's own body, is also one of the most rigid and still. And it is not merely sitting there, this solid iron heart. It is doing something. It has been doing it, slowly and secretly, for as long as there has been an earth at all. What that solid heart is doing, as best we can tell, is turning. Not turning with the rest of the planet exactly, and not turning against it either, but turning at its own quiet pace, a little out of step with everything stacked above it. You spin once a day, of course. The ground beneath you, the mantle, the crust, the oceans, the air, all of it wheels around once every 24 hours, and you go with it, without ever feeling the motion. But the inner core, that crushed iron ball at the very middle, does not seem content simply to come along for the ride. It appears to rotate at a slightly different rate, gaining or losing the faintest fraction of a turn on the world around it, and over enough time those tiny differences add up. How much they add up to is one of the strange small facts that stays with you once you have heard it. Some of the measurements suggest that the inner core, relative to the surface you are lying on, completes roughly one extra full rotation every 1,000 years or so. Set that against a single human life, and it is nothing at all. a movement so slow you could never hope to feel it, a drift you would need a dozen lifetimes even to notice. But set it against the span of a civilization, against the whole length of recorded history, and it becomes something else. Since the first cities were built, since the first words were pressed into clay, that iron heart has turned over on itself several extra times, quietly, in the dark, beneath every empire that ever rose, and every one that ever fell. And no one felt a thing. Here is where the story becomes genuinely uncertain, and it is worth being honest about that as we go. In January of 2023, a study appeared in the journal Nature Geoscience that made the matter stranger still. The researchers had done something rather beautiful and rather patient. They had gathered records of earthquakes that recur in almost exactly the same place, again and again over the decades, near the South Sandwich Islands in the far southern Atlantic, and they had compared the seismic waves from those repeating events across many years. 121 of these near-identical earthquakes read like a series of photographs taken of the same room at different times, each wave passing down through the inner core on its way to distant instruments. And what those waves seemed to say was that the inner core had not simply been turning steadily in one direction all along. Instead, the pattern suggested something almost tidal. For a stretch of years, from around 2003 to 2008, the inner core appeared to be turning slightly faster than the surface, running a little ahead. And then, from about 2008 onward, it seemed to slow, to fall back into step, and perhaps even to begin drifting the other way, retracing its own path. The authors proposed that this is not a single event, but a rhythm, a slow oscillation that swings back and forth over something like a 70-year cycle, the iron heart of the planet rocking gently one way and then the other, over and over, on a beat far longer than any single human attention could hold. Now, this part is genuinely debated. Other scientists read the same faint signals differently, and the truth is that we are trying to describe the motion of an object we have never seen and never touched, thousands of kilometers beneath our feet, using only the trembling of the ground it sends up to us. So hold it lightly, but allow yourself, just for a moment, the full strange shape of the idea. That at the very centre of the world you live on there is a ball of solid iron nearly 2,500 kilometres across, about as hot as the surface of the sun, held rigid by pressure alone, and it is slowly turning, and slowing, and perhaps quietly reversing, in a rhythm that takes the better part of a century to complete. None of it reaches you. No tremor, no sound, no faintest sense of movement. You could live your whole life on the thin skin of this turning thing, and never once suspect that its heart keeps a slow time all its own. And this is the part that ought to make the ground beneath you feel smaller still, because that turning is not idle. Just above the solid inner core lies the outer core, and the outer core is not solid at all. It is a shell of molten metal more than 2,200 kilometers thick, an ocean of liquid iron and nickel churning at temperatures somewhere between 4,500 and 5,500 degrees Celsius. And as that vast liquid ocean of metal moves, rising where it is heated, sinking where it cools, wheeling in slow currents around the solid heart at the middle, it does something no ordinary ocean of water could ever do. Moving metal carries electric current, and electric current, wound into great circulating loops on that scale, raises a magnetic field. This is the engine, the deep dynamo, that lifts the invisible field you have lived inside every second of your life without once being aware of it. Down there at its source, that field is roughly 50 times stronger than the gentle whisper of it that finally reaches a compass needle at the surface. And it does something for you that is difficult to overstate. The sun does not only pour out light, it pours out a thin, ceaseless wind of charged particles, a stream that would, given the chance, reach the top of the air and begin to carry it away, molecule by molecule, until the sky itself thinned toward nothing. The magnetic field raised by that churning core reaches far out beyond the atmosphere and turns that wind aside, sweeping it around the world the way a stone in a stream parts the water. Consider, if you like, what its absence would mean. As far as we can tell, that field is one of the quiet prerequisites for life of our kind to exist at all, which is to say that the ordinary night around you, the safe air moving in and out of you, the water in your body, the sky that will still be there in the morning, rests in part on whether a ball of iron at the centre stays warm enough to turn and stir the metal above it. And even that heart, it turns out, is not the last door. Within the solid inner core, seismologists believe they have found something smaller and stranger again, an innermost region, a heart within the heart, where the very crystals of iron are lined up in a different direction from the rest, pointing one way where all the iron around them points another. It is as though the centre of the world carries the fossil of some enormous event, some deep rearrangement that may have happened around 500 million years ago, long before anything walked or crawled or swam, a memory locked into metal that we are only now beginning to read. And that word, read, is the one to hold on to as we go a little further down, because it ought to stop you where you lie. No drill has ever come close to any of this. No eye has ever seen it. Nothing human has touched the outer core, or the inner core, or that stranger heart within the heart, and, in all honesty, nothing ever will. The deepest hole we have ever managed barely broke the skin of the crust. And yet, lying here in the dark, you can be told its width, and its heat, and its slow and rocking turn, with a confidence that feels almost unreasonable, which leaves the quietest and largest question of the whole long descent, the one we have been circling from the very first meter. If no one has ever gone there, and no one ever can, then how exactly does anyone know? And the honest answer, the one that ought to loosen something in your chest rather than tighten it, is that no one knows the way you know the floor beneath your bed. You know that floor by pressing on it. You could, if you wanted, kneel down and lay your palm flat against the boards and feel that they are solid and cool and real. But no palm has ever been laid against the outer core. No one has knelt on the inner core the way you might kneel on a floor. So the knowing is not that kind of knowing at all. It is not the knowledge of touch, it is the knowledge of listening. And the strange and beautiful fact, the one that turns this whole long descent on its head, is that the planet beneath you is not silent. It is ringing, very quietly, all the time, and we have learned to hear it. Think of it like this. If you want to understand a room in the dark, you have two choices. You can crawl across it with your hands out, mapping the furniture by collision, which is slow and painful and tells you only about the small patch you happen to be crawling through. Or you can clap your hands and listen to how the sound comes back. The echo tells you the size of the room, the height of the ceiling, whether the walls are near or far, whether there is carpet or bare stone, all without you moving an inch. What we have done with the earth is closer to the second thing than the first. The drill, that heroic 12-kilometre needle on the Kola Peninsula, was the crawling. It was the hand held out in the dark, feeling its way, and it barely left the near corner of the room. The listening is something else entirely. The listening reaches all the way to the centre and back. But here is the part that is easy to misunderstand, so let me set it down plainly. We do not clap. We are not the ones who make the sound. That would be far too small a gesture for a body this large. The earth makes its own sound, and it makes it whenever the crust slips, whenever two plates that have been straining against each other for a century finally lurch and release. We call that an earthquake, and we tend to think of it only as a thing that shakes cities and cracks roads. But an earthquake is also something gentler and grander than its damage. It is a pulse of energy that does not stay near the surface. It dives. It travels down through the crust and into the mantle and onward, spreading out through the whole interior of the planet as a set of waves, the way the sound of a struck bell spreads through the metal of the bell. Every large earthquake rings the earth like that, and scattered across the continents, in quiet vaults and boreholes and basement rooms, sit thousands of exquisitely sensitive instruments, waiting to catch the ringing when it arrives on the far side. So the tool is not a shovel, but a stethoscope. We do not go down to the interior. We wait for the interior to send its report up to us, written in the timing and the bending of these waves, and we have been learning, patiently, for more than a century, how to read it. Now, there is a trick hidden inside this, and it is the trick that makes the whole thing work, so stay with me for just a moment even as you drift. When the earth rings, it does not send just one kind of wave. It sends two that matter most for our purposes. Two messengers with very different habits. The first is a wave of compression, a push and a pull, squeezing the rock together and stretching it apart along the direction it travels, the same way sound moves through air. That one is quick, the fastest thing the planet produces, and so it always arrives first, and for that reason it was named simply the primary wave. The second is slower, and it moves in a different manner altogether. It shakes the rock sideways, back and forth across its path, the way a rope snaps if you flick one end. That is the secondary wave, the one that comes second, dragging a little behind its faster sibling. And this is where the magic lives. Not in either wave alone, but in the difference between them. Because that sideways shaking wave, the secondary one, has a peculiar weakness. It can only travel through something solid. It needs the material it passes through to hold its shape, to resist being sheared, and a liquid cannot do that. A liquid has no sideways to hold. Pour it and it flows, shear it, and it simply gives way. So when a secondary wave, travelling down through the solid mantle, arrives at something molten, it stops. It cannot cross. It is swallowed, and it goes no further. The compression wave carries on, slowing and bending, but the shear wave dies at the door. Now hold that in your mind and consider what happens after a great earthquake. All around the world the instruments listen, and on the far side of the planet, in a broad ring of stations, something is missing. The compression waves arrive, altered and delayed, but altered in ways we can account for. The shear waves, though, never come. There is a whole zone of the Earth's surface, a great curved band, where the sideways shaking wave simply fails to appear, as though it had walked into a wall somewhere deep inside and never walked out, and there is only one honest explanation for a wall that stops a shear wave and lets a compression wave limp through. Somewhere down there, the solid rock must give way to something that is not solid, something liquid, an enormous molten shell wrapped around the very center of the world. Sit with what that means, because it is one of the quietest astonishments in all of science. No one melted a sample. No one lowered a thermometer into that ocean of iron. We know the outer core is liquid not because we saw it, but because of a shadow cast not by light, but by sound, in a place no light has ever reached. The absence of a wave, the silence where a wave should have been, is the evidence. We deduced a molten sea 2,000 kilometers beneath our feet from the shape of a hole in the data. So let me demolish, gently, a few things you might have believed without ever quite deciding to. You might have assumed, as almost everyone quietly does, that we know what is inside the earth, because someone, somewhere, brought a piece of it up. We did not. Not 1 gram of the mantle, not 1 atom of the core, has ever been held in a human hand. Every fragment of rock we have ever studied comes from the thin outer rind, or from material the planet itself spat upward through volcanoes, which is still only the shallow stuff. The deep interior has never been sampled, and, as we said, never will be. You might have imagined that the picture of the layers, the crust and the mantle and the 2 cores nested one inside the other, was arrived at by digging until we hit each one. It was not. The digging failed at the first layer. The picture was assembled almost entirely from waves. And you might carry, as a great many people do, the old childhood image of the earth as a ball of glowing lava, with only a crust of rock floating on top, molten more or less all the way down. That too is wrong, and the waves are how we know it is wrong. The mantle, for all its heat, is not a sea of lava. It is solid rock, rock that flows over ages but rings like a solid to a passing wave. Only the outer core is truly liquid, and the very center, the inner core, hotter than the mantle, hotter than the molten shell around it, is not liquid at all. It is solid again. The earth is not a simple thing that melts as you go down. It is layered and counterintuitive, solid then liquid then solid, and every boundary in that sequence was found by listening. This is the pivot the whole night turns on, so let me say it once more before we go deeper, because it recasts everything you have heard so far. That confidence you noticed, the one that felt almost unreasonable, the way I could tell you the width of the inner core and the heat of the core, and the slow rocking of its turn as though reading it from a page, is not arrogance, and it is not guesswork. It is the accumulated echo of 10,000 earthquakes, caught and compared and cross-checked across more than 100 years, until the interior of the planet came into focus the way a photograph swims up out of a developing tray. We built a map of a place we can never visit out of the trembling it sends us whenever it moves, not by reaching in, but by holding still and paying attention, not by conquering the deep, but by learning, at last, to hear it speak. And once you understand that the tool is listening, a further thought follows, one that carried a single quiet woman with a single quiet paper to a conclusion the whole world had missed. If a shadow can tell you where the liquid begins, then a fainter shadow, a smaller flaw in the pattern, a wave arriving somewhere it truly should not, might tell you about something hidden even inside the molten heart, something the first listeners never thought to look for. Her name was Inge Lehmann, and she was born in Copenhagen in the year 1888, into a world that did not, on the whole, expect a woman to spend her life reading the tremors of a planet. She would spend it doing precisely that. She would live to be 104 years old, publishing careful papers into her 90s, long after most of the men who once doubted her had gone quiet. And in the year 1929, a large earthquake broke loose beneath New Zealand, on the far side of the world from her instruments, and the waves it sent racing through the deep earth arrived, some of them, in a place they had no permission to be. That small wrongness, that faint tap where silence had been promised, was the loose thread she would pull until the whole picture came undone and was remade. To understand what she noticed, you have to hold on to the idea of the shadow again and turn it gently in your hand. When a great earthquake shudders, it floods the planet with those pressure waves, and many of them dive straight through the center and out the other side. But the liquid outer core, that churning ocean of molten metal, bends them as they enter, the way a spoon standing in a glass of water appears to bend at the surface. Because of that bending, there is a wide ring on the far side of the Earth, a band curving around the opposite face, where these particular waves should never land. Geologists had mapped that ring. They called it the shadow zone, and for years it behaved exactly as a single liquid heart predicts. Waves went silent there, faithfully, quake after quake. It was one of the tidiest facts in the whole young science. And then, into that region of promised silence, faint arrivals began to appear. Not loud ones, not the full-throated signal of a wave that had taken the easy road, but a hush of energy, a whisper turning up, where the theory swore nothing could reach. A lesser mind might have called it error, a fault in the instrument, a smudge on the record to be wiped away. Lehmann did not wipe it away. She sat with it. She gathered the readings from station after station, and she asked the patient question that lies at the root of every real discovery. What single hidden thing, if it were true, would make all of these small wrongnesses suddenly right? Her answer was as bold as it was simple. Those faint waves were echoes. Somewhere down inside the liquid, they had struck a hard surface and bounced, and that bounce had flung them into the shadow. The core was not one thing. It was two. A liquid shell, yes, but wrapped around a solid center, a hidden ball of something firm at the very middle of the world. She wrote it up in the year 1936, in a paper with what may be the shortest and strangest title in the history of the earth sciences. She called it, simply, P', two characters standing for a whole new region of the planet. And though it took the wider community years to accept, the observations kept agreeing with her, echo after echo, quake after quake, until the boundary she had heard was given her name. To this day, the surface where the liquid outer core meets the solid inner core is called the Lehmann discontinuity. A woman who never set foot more than a few kilometers below sea level had reached out with nothing but arriving sound and touched the deepest solid thing there is. Now hold still, because here is where the whole night quietly turns over. Picture, for a moment, what you have always half believed lived at the center of the earth. If you are like most people, you were taught or you simply absorbed an image of molten fire, a glowing pool of liquid rock, a furnace of lava seething at the core of the world, It is a beautiful picture. It is on the covers of old books. And it is at the very center wrong. The middle of the earth is not a lake of fire. It is not liquid at all. It is solid. A single vast crystalline sphere of iron and nickel, roughly 1,220 kilometers in radius, which is to say near 2,440 kilometers from side to side, sitting still and firm beneath 5,000 kilometers of rock and molten metal. Not a pool, but a ball. Not fire you could pour, but metal you could, in principle, stand upon, if standing there were not the last thing you would ever do. And here is the part that undoes the ordinary intuition entirely, the reframe hiding inside the reframe. You would assume that the center is solid because it is the coolest place, the way the middle of anything left out overnight goes cold and stiff. The opposite is true. The inner core is not cool. It is savagely, unimaginably hot, somewhere around 5,200 degrees Celsius, which is very nearly the temperature of the glowing surface of the sun itself. There is a small, real star's worth of heat locked in the middle of the ground beneath your bed. By every rule you learnt as a child about heat and melting, that iron ought to be liquid. It ought to be the most liquid thing on the planet, and yet it is stone solid, and the reason is not temperature at all. The reason is pressure, not heat then, but weight is what keeps the heart of the world firm. Think of the entire mass of the planet pressing inward from every direction at once, the whole crushing column of rock and metal and ocean bearing down toward a single point. At the center, that squeeze reaches something close to 3.5 million times the pressure of the ordinary air resting on your chest right now. And under a fist that colossal, the atoms of iron simply cannot break ranks and flow. They are held. They are pinned into a rigid lattice, shoulder to shoulder, forbidden to become a liquid no matter how hot they grow. There is a relationship worked out by careful physics that describes exactly this, the way the melting point of a metal climbs as you lean harder and harder upon it. Squeeze iron hard enough, and it stays solid past temperatures that would vaporize it at the surface. So the inner core is solid not in spite of its ferocious heat, but in a strange standoff with it. A thing kept whole by the very violence trying to tear it apart. And threaded through that solid iron, in vanishing traces, are stranger guests still, small measures of sulfur, and even gold, and platinum, and cobalt, a faint fortune of heavy metal, buried at the one address no one will ever visit. Sit with that inversion for a moment, the way it quietly rearranges the room. The deepest place is not the softest, but the hardest. The hottest thing beneath you is not molten, but firm. The center of the earth is not a furnace pouring itself into fire, but a single enormous crystal, held motionless by a pressure so vast that heat itself loses the argument. Everything you were taught to imagine gets turned, gently, inside out. And yet a solid ball, sitting still at the middle of a spinning world, is not quite the end of the story either, because that inner core, it turns out, does not simply sit. Lemon heard the boundary. Those who came after her, listening to the same faint echoes with sharper and sharper ears, began to notice that the boundary itself was doing something no one had thought to ask about. The solid heart was moving, and the way it moves, and what may hide even deeper within it, is where the deep quiet of tonight now begins to lead. Think, first, about what it truly means for something to turn on its own, deep inside something else. The inner core is not fixed to the mantle above it. It is not welded to the rock, not anchored to the crust, not tied in any rigid way to the ground beneath your body tonight. It sits instead in the liquid metal of the outer core, somewhat a solid ball the size of a small planet, suspended in a molten sea, free to spin at its own pace. And so it does. For most of the century since laymen first traced its edge, we quietly assumed it simply came along for the ride, turning once a day with everything else, a passenger on the planet's rotation. But the echoes told a subtler story. The inner core, it seems, does not keep perfect step with the world around it. It turns a little faster, not dramatically, and not in any way a clock on your wall would ever betray. Just slightly, patiently, gaining on the rest of the earth by something like one extra full turn every 1,000 years. Let that figure settle for a moment, because it is exactly the kind of number the everyday hides from you completely. One extra rotation in 1,000 years. Across the whole span of your own life, the solid heart of the earth will slip ahead of the surface by only a small sliver of a single turn, a nudge of a few degrees, a motion you could never feel and never see. But stretch the time scale, the way the deep always asks to be stretched, and the picture quietly rearranges itself. Across all of recorded human history, since the first cities rose beside the first rivers, that inner core has made only 5 or 6 extra revolutions relative to the ground above it. Since the last great ice sheets loosened their grip on the north, perhaps 10. It is the slowest carousel imaginable, a thing for which 1,000 years is scarcely more than a heartbeat. And yet, unmistakably, it moves. For a long while even that slow gain was taken to be steady, a constant creeping lead, the same small surplus, turn after turn after turn. But listening more closely, some seismologists began to suspect the truth was stranger, and gentler still. In January of 2023, a paper in the journal Nature Geoscience suggested that the inner core does not simply run ahead of us forever. Instead, it appears to swing. It edges past the surface for a while, then eases, then falls behind, then slowly catches up again, a long ponderous rocking back and forth, like the far end of a pendulum's travel, where the motion almost stops before it reverses. The researchers studied the seismic fingerprints of 121 repeating earthquakes near the South Sandwich Islands, down in the cold and lonely reaches of the Southern Ocean, and traced their pattern across the decades. By their reading, the inner core super-rotated, ran ahead of us from around 2003 to 2008, and then, from 2008 onward, it began to backtrack, retracing its own path along the same faint groove it had just carved. If they have read it rightly, the entire cycle takes something close to 70 years to complete. One slow breath of the planet's deepest chamber, a swing out and a swing back, spanning very nearly a single human lifetime. A child born at one turning point might live to see the core arrive at the next, though of course that child would feel nothing whatsoever. And I should be honest with you here, as the hour grows late and honesty costs nothing at all. This is not settled. This is the living edge of the science, the part still being turned over in quiet rooms, and other careful people read the very same echoes differently. Some hear a shorter rhythm, some a longer one, and some question whether the inner core turns independently at all. We are listening, remember, to the faintest of signals, the sound of distant earthquakes, bent through thousands of kilometers of iron minus, and reasonable minds disagree about what the signals are saying. You do not need to resolve it tonight. No one has resolved it yet. It is enough, perhaps, simply to hold the possibility loosely that far beneath you, a ball of solid metal wider than the moon may be rocking, ever so slowly, on a rhythm of 70 years. And here is where the strangeness folds inward upon itself one more time, miseness. Because the inner core, it now seems, may not be a single simple thing either. Just as laymen found a solid ball hidden within the liquid, so others, listening harder in the years since, have begun to find something hidden within the solid, a core inside the core, an innermost region sitting at the very centre of the centre-niceness. And what marks it out is not that it is hotter nor denser nor made of anything new. What marks it out is that its iron is arranged differently. In the great bulk of the inner core, the crystals of iron tend to line themselves up in one direction, roughly along the axis the Earth spins upon, running from pole to pole, a north and south grain, like the grain that runs the length of a plank of wood. But in this deepest heart, the grain appears to turn. The crystals lie east and west instead, across the planet rather than along it, as though the wood in the very middle of the plank had been cut from a different tree, and the only sensible reason for a change so deep and so complete is that this innermost heart must have frozen under different conditions from the shell that later grew around it. That at some moment in the unimaginable past, perhaps 500 million years ago, something happened to the Earth's core, some shift, some quiet reorganization, some slow catastrophe we have no record of and no name for, pressing a different pattern into the very middle before the rest of the inner core crystallized over it, ring upon ring, the way a tree lays down its years. 500 million years. Try, gently, to reach for that. It is a time before there were bones, before anything walked, or crawled, or lifted a leaf toward the light on dry land. The seas held only soft and simple things, and the continents were bare rock under a strange sky minus. And already by then the very centre of the world had frozen, and locked its private orientation into place, and has kept it faithfully ever since. Whatever we build, whatever we forget, that arrangement remains turned east and west at the middle of everything, older than the first shell and the first eye. So consider, if you have the patience for it this late, what is actually stacked beneath you, layer within layer, each one nested inside its own quiet contradiction. You are lying still on ground that feels perfectly firm. Under that ground is rock, which given enough time, flows like something almost liquid. Under that flowing rock is a true ocean of liquid metal, churning in the dark, and suspended within that liquid ocean is a solid ball that turns on its own, faster than the world it hangs inside. And buried at the heart of that solid ball is another solid heart, its grain running the wrong way, marked by an event so ancient that nothing alive now carries any memory of it. A solid inside a liquid, inside a solid inside a solid. A crystal grown within a crystal. Not one heart, but a heart within a heart within a heart, and none of it, not a single layer of it, is anything the surface of your ordinary day would ever let you guess. This is the thing the everyday so kindly hides. The floor holds, the walls stand, the water in your glass sits flat and still, and behaves. Nothing in the plain evidence of your senses would ever suggest that the temperature at the centre approaches 5,200 degrees minus, as hot as the glowing surface of the sun minus, and that the metal there stays solid all the same, not because it is cool, but because it is squeezed. Squeezed by a pressure near 3.5 million times the weight of the air resting on your skin right now. That is the arithmetic hiding under the calm, heat enough to boil any furnace we have ever built, held frozen by a force too large to picture, and the whole crushed and crystalline mass of it turning and rocking and keeping its 500 million year secret, all at once, all the time, directly below the small warm room in which you are trying to fall asleep. And none of these are numbers you were built to hold. Your body knows meters and moments, the length of a hallway, the span of a single day. It was never fitted to feel 1,000 years pass as one slow tick, or to sense a swing of 70 years as a single breath, or to reach back 500 million years and find the center of the world already made. The mathematics runs far past the edge of what the senses can carry, and that is not a failure in you. It is simply the shape of the thing. The earth keeps its deepest arithmetic in a language of pressures and ages and rotations that no hand can touch and no eye can check, and we have learnt to read a few sentences of it only by pressing our ears to the ground and waiting patiently for the whole planet to ring. And ring it does. When the ground breaks somewhere along a distant fault, when one slab of rock finally slips past another after centuries of holding still, the shudder does not stay near the wound. It travels. It sets the entire planet quivering, softly, on a note far too low and slow for any ear to catch, a single deep tone that the whole body of the earth sounds all at once, and within that tone are two separate voices, two families of wave moving at two different speeds. There are the faster ones which press and release the rock ahead of them, squeezing it and letting it spring back, much the way a sound moves through the air you are breathing now. And there are the slower ones, which shake the rock from side to side as they pass, the way a long rope shudders when you flick one end of it. The fast waves can travel through nearly anything, through solid and liquid alike. The slow ones cannot cross a liquid at all. A liquid has nothing to hold its shape, nothing to shake sideways, and so the slow waves simply stop when they meet one, and go no further. Hold that small fact gently, because it is the whole secret of how we came to know the center of the world. When a great earthquake rings the planet, instruments scattered across every continent listen for the two voices to arrive. And there is a region on the far side of the earth, a wide band of the surface, where the slow waves never come. They set out, they travel down into the deep, and somewhere far below they meet something they cannot cross, and there they are swallowed. That silent band is not empty. It is the shadow cast by a liquid core, drawn for us not in sound, but in the absence of it. We did not see the molten iron. We heard the place where the sideways note fell quiet, and from that quiet we reasoned our way to an ocean of metal more than 2,000 kilometers deep. This is the strange truth that sits beneath everything you have heard tonight. We have never been there. Not one of us. Not once. No drill has scratched even 100th of the way down. The deepest hole we ever managed, that narrow Russian wound of 12,260-odd meters, gave out in soft hot rock long before the crust itself was through. No hand has ever held a piece of the true mantle, still warm from where it belongs. Every figure the heat of the outer core, the solid ball at the very center, the weight that holds it firm, every one of them was red from the outside, from the way the planet rings and bends and hands us back the light of its own trembling. We have come to know the deep the way you might come to know a sealed and windowless room in total darkness, by nothing but the echoes of your own voice thrown back to you off its unseen walls. And what a room it is, to have learnt so much about, and to have touched so little. Consider, slowly, everything that is true of it, and yet entirely absent from within it. No light has ever reached it. Not one particle of sunlight, in 4.5 billion years, has ever fallen there. No day has ever dawned in the inner core, and no dusk has ever closed one. No season has ever turned. No wind has ever crossed the liquid iron, though it moves in currents wider than any sea. No eye has ever opened there, and nothing that lives there for nothing has ever known that a surface exists at all, that there is a thin bright skin of the world where rain falls and children sleep. The centre of the earth has been perfectly, utterly dark since before the first living cell, and it will remain so long after the last one is gone. It is the oldest darkness you will ever be a part of, and it is holding you up, right now, from directly beneath the floor of the room you are lying in. The rules that govern that dark are not the rules your body has learnt to trust. Everywhere in your ordinary life, heat loosens things, and cold sets them hard. You warm the butter to soften it, you chill the water to freeze it. But at the centre of the world, that simple bargain breaks. The inner core rests at a temperature of roughly 5,200 degrees, about as hot as the glowing face of the sun, hot enough to turn iron not merely to liquid, but to vapour anywhere near the surface, and yet it is solid. It is a solid ball of iron, hotter than any furnace, held rigid not by cold but by weight. Nearly 3.5 million times the pressure of the air around you presses in upon it from every side, so hard that the atoms are simply not permitted to break rank and flow. The heat begs the metal to melt, the pressure forbids it, the pressure wins. And so the hottest solid thing anywhere in the earth is kept solid by nothing more than the sheer crushing patience of everything stacked above it. Even time runs to a different measure down there. You were fitted for the tick of a single day and the arc of a single life. But the inner core keeps a slower clock. It is turning, very slightly, faster than the ground you stand upon gaining, the seismic echoes suggest. Something like one extra full turn against the surface every 1,000 years or so. And that small lead does not hold steady. In recent years, seismologists comparing the waves from earthquakes that strike the very same spot again and again, near the South Sandwich Islands at the far bottom of the Atlantic, have suggested that the inner core may run ahead for a stretch and then ease back, swinging gently forward and back over a rhythm of about 70 years. It is a proposal still argued over, still far from settled. The planet does not surrender such things easily, but if it is so, then something at the very heart of the world has been quietly rocking to and fro through the whole span of an ordinary human life, drifting forward through your grandparents' years, easing back through your own, a pendulum the size of the moon that no one will ever feel swing. And deeper even than that, at the core of the core, there seems to be another boundary yet, an innermost heart, set within the inner heart, where the iron crystals lie turned a different way, facing east and west, where those wrapped around them face north and south, as though the metal in that innermost place remembers being made under conditions the outer shell never knew. It is a faint reading, a hint teased from the very quietest echoes we can gather, and it points perhaps to some great rearrangement of the centre around 500 million years ago, back when the first soft strange creatures were only beginning to stir in the shallow warm seas. The middle of the earth may be holding, frozen into the alignment of its atoms, the memory of a day older than very nearly every living thing. And life, when it finally came, went down to meet all of this far further than you would ever guess. Not to the core, nothing living could bear that heat, that weight, but down through the crust, into the warm rock kilometers beneath the fields and the ocean floor, there is a whole hidden world of the living, feeding not on sunlight but on stone, and heat, and the faint slow chemistry of the deep. Most of the single-celled life on this planet does not lie in the light at all. It lies down there, patient, in the dark, and it has been waiting a very long time for us to notice. And when we did at last begin to notice, slowly and almost by accident, what we found was not a scattering of stubborn survivors clinging on in a place they had no business surviving. What we found was a world. Down there, in the warm rock beneath the bed you are lying on, in water that threads through cracks no wider than a held breath, in the soft muds beneath the ocean floor, and the walls of deep mines and the boreholes drilled for reasons that had nothing to do with life at all, there are living things in numbers that quietly rearrange everything you thought you understood about where a creature is allowed to be. Not a fringe, not an exception. A second biosphere, folded into the stone, running in parallel with the bright thin world of leaves and lungs up here in the air, and very likely older than any of it. For a long time we simply could not imagine it. Life as we knew it meant sunlight. It meant a green leaf turning light into sugar, and everything else living, in the end off that one quiet transaction between a plant and a star. Take away the sun, the reasoning went, and you take away the foundation, and the whole cathedral of the living comes down. So the deep rock was assumed to be sterile, hot, airless, lightless, crushed under its own enormous weight. Mice, of course, nothing lived there. And then the samples kept coming up, from the boreholes and the mine faces and the drill cores hauled from beneath the seabed, and the samples kept being, very faintly, alive. You will remember the plankton found 6 kilometers down in that cold Russian hole, small fossil shapes pressed into rock that had not seen the surface in an unimaginable span of time. You will remember the water pooling where no water should have survived, and the hydrogen coming up, boiling out of the stone. It turns out that those 3 things, the water, the hydrogen, the warmth Nyas, are very nearly a recipe. Where rock and water meet in the deep, and the water works slowly on the minerals, it can loosen hydrogen from the stone itself, and hydrogen is fuel. Not the fuel of a fire, but the fuel of a life. And so there are microbes down there that have never met the sun and never needed to, that breathe not oxygen but iron, or sulfur, or the raw chemistry of the rock, and that build their bodies out of the faint energy in the seams where stone gives up its hydrogen a little at a time. They do not eat light, they eat the earth. For years these were curiosities, oddities collected one at a time, and no one could say how much of it there really was. And then, in the year 2018, a great collaboration of scientists, hundreds of them, working together for the better part of a decade under the name of the Deep Carbon Observatory MUNIS, sat down and tried to add it all up, tried to weigh in effect the hidden living world beneath the crust. What they arrived at is one of those numbers you have to say slowly, and then say again, because the first time it simply slides past. They estimated that the life buried in the deep subsurface holds somewhere between 15 and 23 billion tons of carbon. Not 15 or 23 tons. Billion. Enough living carbon, on the higher end of that estimate, to outweigh the carbon in every human being on the planet by something like 300 or 400 times over. All of us, every person who has ever worried in the dark, every crowd in every city, all the warm-breathing weight of humanity, set against the quiet microbial multitude in the rock, and the rock wins by a factor you can barely picture. And it is not a thin scum on the underside of the world either. That same effort estimated that these organisms occupy something on the order of 2 to 2.3 billion cubic kilometers of the planet's interior, a habitat so large that it makes the familiar living surface, the forests and the reefs and the open sea, look like a bright film stretched over something enormous. They reckoned that perhaps 70% of all the bacteria and archaea on Earth, minus the two great ancient domains of single-celled life, the oldest lineages there are, minus do not live up here in the light and the air at all. They live down there, in the dark, in the stone. Which means that the ordinary world, the one you know, the one with weather and colour and the smell of rain, is where the minority of life happens to keep. The majority is underground, and always has been, and simply never told us. Now I want you to feel the strangeness of these lives, because it is a gentle strangeness, and it belongs in a quiet night. Up here, everything runs fast. A heart beats. A day passes. A generation of some small creature is born, and lives, and is gone within an afternoon. Down there, as best we can tell, time runs at a wholly different speed. With so little energy trickling out of the rock, a single one of these deep cells may divide, may do the one thing a living cell most wants to do, and make a copy of itself Evinus. Not once an hour, not once a year, but perhaps once in a century, or once in 1,000 years, or slower still. Some of them may be, in a real sense, older than any tree, older than any recorded thing, individual lives ticking over so slowly that they are barely distinguishable from the stone that holds them. They are not asleep exactly, but they are not awake in any way you would recognize. They are simply patient, on a scale that has no use for the word. And this, perhaps, is why we missed them for so long. They were not hiding, they were only moving too slowly for us to see that they were moving at all. There is a kind of hope in this, and it is worth pausing on before we turn it over. If life can take hold here, nest in total darkness, under crushing weight, with no sun, no plants, no oxygen, feeding on nothing but warm rock and the thin chemistry of water and stone, then life is not the fragile, fussy, once-in-a-universe accident we sometimes fear it to be. It is tougher than that. It asks for very little. Give it a little warmth, a little water, and a little chemistry to feed on, and it seems to find a way to persist, and to keep persisting, quietly, for ages. And that thought reaches outward, off this planet entirely, because there are other worlds. A scarred red planet not far from us, moons wrapped in ice with dark salt oceans sloshing beneath Minas, where there is no sunlight on the surface worth the name, but where there may well be exactly this, warm rock and liquid water, and the slow chemistry of the two together, somewhere down in the dark. We have looked for life by looking for other Earths, for other bright green surfaces under other suns, but the deep biosphere whispers that we may have been looking in the wrong place. That life, if it is out there at all, may not be up in the light where we keep glancing. It may be underground, patient, in the stone on 100 worlds, exactly as it is here. And yet, sit with it a moment longer, and the hope acquires a shadow, the way a warm room acquires one when the lamp is behind you. Because if most of the living earth has been down there all along, older than us, vaster than us, running at a pace that makes our whole restless history look like a single flickering afternoon, then we are not, after all, what the planet is mostly doing. We are not the main event. We are the thin, bright surface, the fast, frantic film of colour and noise on top of something slow and enormous, and almost wholly indifferent to us. The ground beneath your body is not the dead floor you have always felt it to be, the safe, still stage on which everything happens. It is itself alive, in its own patient way, deeper down than we have ever managed to reach, in numbers we can barely count, doing something ancient and quiet that has nothing to do with us, and did not wait for us, and will not miss us when we are gone. That is not a frightening thought, not really, not here in the dark, but it is a humbling one. The earth is not a stone we live upon. It is a living thing we live upon the very edge of. And so we arrive at last at the far side of the descent. We have gone down through the cold black water to the crushed floor of the deepest trench, and found it teeming. We have drilled 12 kilometers into the crust, and found water where there should be none, and fossils, and heat that turned the rock to slow honey. We have listened, through the shivering of earthquakes, all the way down to a solid iron heart, hotter than the surface of the sun, turning at its own strange pace, inside a sea of molten metal. And threaded through the outer layers of all of it, kilometers beneath the fields and the cities and the sleeping continents, we have found this quiet second world of the living, older and larger and slower than our own. There is nothing left below us now to reach. We have gone as deep as the questions go. What remains is not another layer. What remains is to stand back, at the bottom of everything, and ask what all of this together might actually mean. And yet, before you let your gaze lift away from the bottom of the world, it is worth staying a little longer with that second world of the living, because it is far stranger and far larger than the passing mention of it can possibly hold. For most of the history of our science, we quietly assumed that life was a thin coat of paint on the surface of the planet, a bright film of green and blue and breathing things spread across the crust, a few kilometers deep at most, with cold dead stone beneath. That assumption, it turns out, was very nearly upside down. When researchers finally gathered together everything they had learned about life inside the rock, the cells scraped from deep mine shafts, the microbes teased out of ocean drill cores, the sparse strange communities pulled up from boreholes sunk far into the continents, and tried, in the year 2018, to weigh the whole hidden thing at once, the figure they arrived at was quietly staggering. Somewhere between 15 and 23 billion tons of carbon, they estimated, is bound up in living things that will never once feel the sun. Let that settle for a moment. That is not a footnote beside the world you know. By their careful reckoning, it is something on the order of 250 to 383 times as much carbon as is held in every human being alive on the surface tonight. All of us together, every body in every city and every bed. The great mass of the living on this planet is not us. It is not the forests, or the whales, or the coral. It is them. the uncountable small ones, in the dark. And they are almost everywhere beneath you. Close to 70% of all the bacteria and the archaea on Earth, our best estimates now suggest, do not drift in the sunlit sea or turn through the soil of any field, but live down here, threaded through the pores and the hairline cracks of solid rock, filling a volume of the planet somewhere between 2 and 2.3 billion cubic kilometers, a buried ocean of stone that is, in its own slow way, alive. You have already brushed the edges of this world twice tonight, without quite being told that is what you were touching. When the sediments of the deepest trench gave up 7,564 new kinds of microbe, nearly 90% of them never before written down anywhere by anyone, that was this hidden biosphere, reaching up to meet us at the floor of the sea. And when the Kola borehole brought its mud boiling to the surface, rich with hydrogen the geologists had not expected, and yielded the ghosts of tiny plankton, fossilized 6 kilometers down in rock more than 2.5 billion years old, that too was a message from the same deep country of the living, a country we have only ever glimpsed through the very narrowest of windows. We do not fully understand how they live, and it is worth being honest about that. Down there is no sunlight to gather, and so no green thing turns light into food. There is only rock and warmth and the faint chemistry of water moving slowly through stone, and whatever thin energy can be coaxed from it. As best we can tell, life in the deep subsurface goes on at a pace we can scarcely imagine from up here, cells that may not divide for years, or centuries, or perhaps far longer still, sipping so little energy that a single generation might outlast an entire human civilization on the surface above. Whole populations may be, in a sense, barely alive at all, holding on rather than flourishing, keeping the faint ember of themselves lit through spans of time that would make a mountain range feel young. There is a small, warm hope folded into all of this, if you would like to carry it into the dark with you tonight. It is simply this, that life, once it begins, seems to ask for so very little. Not warmth as we know it, not light, not air, not the gentle mildness of the surface and is only rock, and water, and a trickle of chemical energy, and time. If life can settle on the crushing floor of the Mariana Trench, and pool in the scalding pores of stone kilometers beneath a frozen northern plain, and quietly outnumber and outmass everything that walks and swims and flies in the light, then perhaps it is not the fragile, improbable, lonely accident we sometimes fear it to be. Perhaps, on other worlds, beneath other crusts, in the warm dark far from any sun, something not entirely unlike this is holding on to Mises patient, and slow, and unbothered, waiting in rock that no one will ever drill. But there is a shadow that comes in alongside that hope, and it would be dishonest to send you towards sleep without it. For all our talk of reaching the deep, we have understood almost none of it. We have gone all the way down to the bottom of the sea, 12 kilometers into the crust, down through the shivering of earthquakes to the iron heart itself. And what we have mostly discovered is the sheer scale of what we do not know, and were wrong about, and had never even thought to ask. We are a young and hurried species, living our whole flickering lives on the thin, lit skin of a world whose vast interior turns and flows and lives on timescales that pay us no attention at all. And already, before we have begun to truly know that hidden world, we have started to leave our marks upon it, our warmth, our chemistry, our discarded things drifting down into places we once assumed no one would ever have to answer for. The deep does not know that we are here. That perhaps is at once the most comforting thing about it, and the most sobering. So this is where the long descent ends. Not against a wall, but against a question. There is nothing left below to reach now, no deeper floor to stand upon, no further layer to name. All that remains is to turn, here at the bottom of everything, and look back up the long dark column we have travelled, and ask what it might mean that the world beneath your feet is so much older, so much larger, so much stranger, and so very much more alive than the small bright surface where we spend our brief days. That is not a question with a tidy answer waiting at the end of it, but it is perhaps the gentlest kind of question to hold as the ground holds you now, and to that question, slowly, with nothing left to dig through but ourselves, we will turn. And so gently we turn. Not with a drill now, and not with a sounding line, but with something quieter and lighter in the hand, a question, the kind you might turn over slowly in the dark, the way you would turn a small stone in your palm, not to crack it open, not to force an answer from it, but only to feel the weight and the shape of it against your skin. What does it mean, this thing we have found beneath us? What does it mean that the ground you are lying on tonight is not a floor at all, but the thinnest possible skin stretched over something older and hotter and stranger than almost anything the daylight ever shows you? Perhaps it means one thing, or perhaps it means quite another. And perhaps, if we are honest and unhurried about it, the truest reading is that it means both of these things at the same time, held loosely together, the way two low notes can sound at once in a quiet room, without either one silencing the other. Perhaps first of all it means that you are very small. That is one honest reading, and it is worth resting with for just a moment, softly, before you let it drift on past you. Because everything you have ever touched, everyone you have ever loved, every city and every harvest and every war and every lullaby in the whole long story of our kind, has happened on a film of cool rock so thin that we have never once managed to drill all the way through it. The deepest scratch we ever made in the surface of the world reached a little over 12 kilometers down, and stopped there, defeated by heat, at rock so warm it had begun to soften and flow like something half melted, rather than break like something solid. And that 12 kilometers, the deepest wound our whole species has ever opened in the planet Minus, was not even 1/5 of 1% of the distance to the centre. It did not pierce the crust so much as scratch the varnish. Below it lay the mantle, nearly 3,000 kilometers of slowly turning rock. Below that, the outer core, an ocean of liquid iron. Below that, the inner core, a solid metal heart the size of a small moon, held at a temperature close to that of the surface of the sun, and kept solid not by cold, but by a pressure so immense, nearly 3.5 million times the pressure of the air that is resting on you now, that even that furnace of a metal cannot bring itself to melt. None of it knows that you are here. The rocks that came up out of the borehole were more than 2.5 billion years old, older than the fish, older than the forests, older than the oxygen in the breath you just took. The deep was already ancient beyond telling before there was anything on the surface with eyes to wonder at it. And it will go on turning and glowing and slowly convecting its vast, slow heat long after the last of us has gone, entirely untroubled, entirely unaware. That is one reading. We are a brief, bright warmth on the outside of a very old fire, and the fire does not feel us at all. But there is another reading, and it turns the whole picture over so gently that you might almost miss the moment it happens. For that same enormous indifference, that same churning ocean of liquid iron, 4,500 to 5,500 degrees hot, moving in vast, slow currents beneath your resting body, that is not only the strangest place in all the world, it is also quietly the reason you are alive to think about it, because as that molten metal turns, it does something that no still, cold, sensible ball of rock could ever do. It generates a field, an invisible field of magnetism, some 50 times stronger down there at the core than it is up here at the surface, reaching out through all those thousands of kilometers of rock and out beyond the ground and beyond the clouds and far out into space, wrapping the entire planet in a shape you cannot see and have never felt and could not live for very long without. The sun does not only warm us. The sun also blows a constant thin wind of charged particles streaming outward that would, over the long ages, strip the air from an unprotected world and scour its surface bare. And it is the deep, the untouchable, unreachable deep, the one place we will almost certainly never go, that turns that wind aside. The churning of the core makes the shield holds the sky holds the air. And the air is the thing moving in and out of you, slowly, right now, as you begin to grow heavy against the pillow. So consider, softly, what that actually means. The most alien place on Earth, the place least like anything a human body could survive, the place we cannot see and cannot sample and can only ever read at second hand through the trembling of distant earthquakes. That place is not your enemy, and it is not a horror waiting beneath the floorboards. It is closer to a keeper. It is not the thing that threatens the fragile surface. It is the thing that makes the fragile surface possible in the first place. The deep is not indifferent to you in the way a stranger is indifferent, coldly, with its back turned. It is indifferent to you the way a foundation is indifferent to the house it holds up. Not watching, not caring, and yet, without ever meaning to, keeping the whole thing standing. And there is a strange tenderness in that, if you let yourself feel it. The furthest, coldest, most inhuman fact about your world is also, when you follow it all the way down, the reason there is a warm and breathing world at all. Hold both of those readings then at once. You are small, and the deep does not know you, and the deep is also the quiet, tireless engine that keeps you here. These are not opposites you have to choose between before you are allowed to sleep. They are two true things about the same iron heart, and the mind does not have to resolve them tonight. It never really has to resolve them at all. It only has to hold them the way you might hold two smooth stones in the same loose hand, and feel how, against all expectation, they settle together and do not clatter. And here, at the bottom of everything, is the small piece of freedom I would leave with you. Because you do get to choose, in a manner of speaking, which of these two truths you carry down into sleep, not by deciding that one of them is right and the other one wrongness. They are both entirely stubbornly true mindness, but by deciding, gently, which one you rest your weight against as the lamp goes out. You can lie here and feel only the smallness, the thin skin, the immense old fire that will outlast you and never once turn its head. That feeling is real, and there are nights when it is the honest one, and there is no shame in it. Or you can lie here and feel the other thing entirely, that you are being held, that beneath the mattress and beneath the floor and beneath the deepest hole we ever dug and the deepest trench the ocean ever cut, there is a vast, slow turning that asks nothing of you, that is never asked anything of you, and that has been quietly keeping the sky above you fastened in place since long before you had a name. You did not build it. You do not maintain it. You could not stop it if you tried. It simply turns and turns and turns, and because it does, you get to breathe and rest and let the day fall away from you. That, I think, is a kinder thing to carry into the dark than fear. Not a denial of how small we are. The deep will not let you pretend otherwise, and there is no honesty in trying, but a quiet reframing of what that smallness sits inside. To be small is not, it turns out, to be abandoned. To be brief is not the same as to be unheld. You are a passing warmth on the surface of an ancient world, yesness, but that ancient world is not a tomb you are standing on. It is a heart, and it is beating, slowly, on a rhythm measured not in seconds, but in thousands and millions of years, and every single beat of it, whether you ever think of it again or not, is spent keeping the thin bright ledge where you live from blowing away into the cold. There is nothing you need to do about that tonight. There is nothing you could do. That is precisely the comfort of it. Some things hold you up entirely without your help, and the deep, in its enormous, glowing, unbothered way, is the oldest and steadiest of them all. So you can loosen your grip now. You can stop keeping watch. The thing beneath you has been keeping watch, in its own blind and burning fashion, for 4.5 billion years, and it does not need you awake to go on doing it. And so we come, slowly, to the last small question, the one this whole long night has quietly been circling. Perhaps the centre of the earth is a place, a solid ball of iron and nickel, some 1,220 kilometres across, hotter than the surface of the sun, and kept from melting by nothing but the unimaginable weight of the world pressing in upon it from every side. Or perhaps it is not really a place at all. Perhaps it is better understood as a process, a slow and ceaseless becoming, iron freezing grain by grain onto that inner sphere, while the liquid metal above it turns and turns without rest, so that the word centre is only the name we have given to a thing that never once holds still. You do not have to decide between them tonight. Both may be true at once, and that, if you let it be, is its own kind of permission. Because here is what is yours, and yours alone, to do with exactly as you please. You can take everything you have heard, the trench and the borehole, the snailfish in the black, the fossil plankton 6 kilometres down, Inge Lehmann listening to a wave that arrived where no wave should ever have been minus, and you can hold it lightly or set it down entirely and lose no part of its truth. None of it asks anything of you. Knowing about the deep changes nothing the deep is doing. It burned and turned and held the sky in place for 4.5 billion years before anyone gave it a single name, and it will do precisely the same long after every name we have is forgotten. You are free, then, to have simply been someone who wondered about it once, on a quiet night, before sleep. That is enough. That was always going to be enough. And consider, as perhaps the last full thought before you let go, the strangest and gentlest thread of all. The iron that makes the core is the very same iron that makes your blood. The atoms carrying breath quietly through your body at this moment were forged in the hearts of stars that died before the earth was ever born, and some of that same ancient iron sank, long ago, into the burning centre you have been resting above this entire time. You are not standing upon the deep, separate from it, a small warm stranger on a cold machine. You are made of the same old fire. The distance between the iron in your veins and the iron at the heart of the world is not a gulf but a family resemblance. 6,000 kilometers of rock lie between them, and they are in the end the same substance, keeping the same slow promise in two different rooms. So let the smallness come, if it comes at all, but do not mistake it for insignificance. To be small inside something this vast and this old is not to be lost within it, it is to belong to it. The deep does not diminish you by being enormous. In its blind and patient way, it gathers you in. There is no despair to be found at the bottom of the world, only a great, warm, unhurried steadiness that was here long before you and will remain glowing and untroubled when the light of this single day has gone out entirely. That is not a frightening thought. Held rightly, it is the most comforting one there is. So rest now, wherever you are, whatever the hour has become around you. There is nothing left to solve and nothing left to hold. The deep has you, as it has quietly had everything, from the first cell stirring in the black water to the last soft breath of this long night, and it asks nothing in return but that you allow yourself to be carried. What lies beneath you was never a grave but a hearth, still burning, and it will go on burning, gentle and unbothered, long after you have fallen asleep.